When she woke up late in the morning light and the day had just begun, she opened up her eyes and thought, oh, what a morning. It's not a day for work, it's a day for catching time. Just lying on the beach and having fun. She's going to get ya. All that she wants is another baby. She's gone tomorrow, but all that she wants is another baby. Yeah. All that she wants is another baby. She's gone tomorrow, but all that she wants is another baby. Yeah. All that she wants.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Very good to see you all. I think we're pretty much full at the moment. We've got a live stream on YouTube. We're monitoring, of course, the chat on Canvas, as well as the chat here. So all ingredients for a lovely afternoon chatting about the media in our lives. Before anything else, I want to address a question that was asked by Alexandra in the chat. In all fairness, she sent the question to me earlier via email, and I thought it was such an important question, and I asked her to pose it here. So thanks for that. And I want to start with that. I mean, it's a general question, like what exactly are the differences between the different types of surveillance that we're all experiencing one way or another in this media environment, media and information environment? And then perhaps we can say something very specific to what's happening in countries like Poland right now. Because there is a fascinating development. I mean, around the world, you can see governments of different political signatures getting more nervous about their media for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because they feel the media are too critical, which is kind of the background of what's happening in Poland right now, or they feel the media isn't trustworthy or reliable, and fueling fears of disinformation or fake news, as the former US president used to call it, and those kind of things. Or they feel the media are out of control in terms of people just expressing all kinds of views, including radical or extreme views, whether it's about sexuality or anything else, and that should be curtailed. If you put all of that together, there's a significant surge, if you will, in law and policy making around the world about media. And some of that is online media. Sometimes it's about, you know, good old television, like that still matters, but it really does. Or even print media, or it's about news, or it's about entertainment, or it's about advertising. And not so long ago, England adopted a new policy about what can and cannot be shown in TV advertising. So there's a lot of policy making going on. There's new laws and policies about people's privacy and identity online, and consumer rights, children's rights online, all of a sudden have become a new charter, international charter. So there's a lot going on when it comes to media, and that, I think, is in and of itself an interesting development that really speaks to what we're talking about in this course. But for now, at the moment, let's talk a little bit about surveillance and the specific kinds of surveillance that I've outlined in the lecture, or the additional video on the lecture. Because of course that was a very quick and dirty sort of summary, and I can appreciate that that hasn't all sunk in. If you may or may not remember, the topic of today or of this week is the realization that in our current sort of living information environment, our lives are inherently public. in one way or another. Sometimes very deliberately so, right? We start and maintain often multiple profiles on various social media. We participate in all kinds of accounts, profiles on, whether it's for games or whether it's for shops or whether it's for the supermarket, whether it's for your university, right? You got your nice university ID that gives you access to everything, which also means your data is collected about everything. So the moment, I mean, it's not that surveillance is new. It's just that in this digital context, this always online context, it has become amplified, supercharged, if you will. And especially since 2013, since Edward Snowden, a former official at the National Security Agency in the United States, sort of through WikiLeaks published documents that showed the extent of global surveillance, and not just by the American government, but most governments, sometimes acting together, sometimes acting alone, but either way, collecting enormous amounts of data on everybody. And that's state surveillance. And there's all these other types of surveillance, right? Corporate surveillance done by companies. There's school surveillance or institutional surveillance done by, for example, universities and schools. There even is family surveillance, right? I mean, like at home, data about you is collected and you're being tracked and traced with parents installing stuff on your phones and those kind of things. So surveillance is paramount. It's profound. And in an attempt to sort of appreciate the different kinds of surveillance, to help us come up with a more nuanced appraisal of surveillance, I distinguish between Panoptic, Synoptic, and Omnoptic surveillance. Now, a quick word of warning. These kind of taxonomies, right? That's what they're called. When you subdivide a concept into different layers or different levels or different features, then you create a taxonomy. For the next couple of years, you're going to be slapped in the face with hundreds of these. Like every scientist, every scholar worth their salt will come up with some kind of taxonomy or another. They will say micro, meso, macro. They will say national and local. They will say individual or mass. They will say, 1, 2, 3, 4. You will always get these taxonomies for every theory, for every concept. What you need to bear in mind is that the relationship between these taxonomies and the so-called real world is almost never straightforward. So taxonomies are a useful way to reduce the complexity of a concept, in our case, surveillance, but that doesn't mean that everything in the real world neatly fits in these different categories. You'll find that things overlap, that it isn't black and white, that the reality is way more complex. Obviously so, I would almost say. But the taxonomy is it's a tool, a useful way to sort of cut through the bullshit, to sort of get a grip on something, to use it, to analyze things. But don't get blinded, don't get confused, don't drown in your attempts to make everything sort of fit in a taxonomy. That's not really the point. So that's an important nuance that I just want to mention before we get going. And also as a sort of a word of, I won't say it's a warning, but just sort of like, remind yourselves that studying something using a taxonomy of some kind is useful, but it's not the law. and by all means, address the fact that, for example, what we're going to do today is to look at a certain type of surveillance, and that it can be part of all levels of the taxonomy at the same time. Okay, having said that, let's look at these three different levels of surveillance, right? Panoptic surveillance, in a way, is a surveillance where the few monitor the many. And this is typically the kind of surveillance that most literature, most scholarship, and also most popular fiction and popular literature worries about the most. right? It's Big Brother is watching you. It's the equivalent of the state or the corporation, some generally relatively anonymous entity sort of keeping an eye on everybody, and we can't see who they're keeping an eye on and how they're doing it and what they're going to do with all that data that they're gathering, right? It's state surveillance. It's the documents that are gathered about you, on you, the documents that you have to surrender whenever you want to, go somewhere, travel somewhere, register for something, be a student somewhere. You need your diplomas and your grades and your ID papers and, proof of insurance and all that kind of stuff, right? That is being part of a Panoptic surveillance system. The other two types of surveillance are less often spoken about because they seem inherently more participatory and perhaps a little more democratic. So that's interesting that there immediately is a normative dimension to the whole surveillance debate, right? So a lot of hello, a lot of people would like to. I'm just gonna. Yep, thank you. So a lot of people love to sort of theorize and pontificate and be critical of the surveillance society, but what they're actually worried about is a few monitoring the many. Because the opposite happens too, where the many monitor the few. In fact, a wonderful colleague, John Thompson, at Cambridge University in the UK, he recently retired. He wrote 20 years ago about what he called the politics of the new visibility. And what the point that he was making is that, nobody can really get away with anything anymore, especially politicians, right? Everything is visible. That doesn't only mean that, they constantly are available in front of cameras to give press conferences and speeches and rallies and so on and so forth. They're not just constantly being interviewed if you're a political leader or something by the press. But it also means that wherever you are, there will be somebody there with a flippant phone recording what you just did and what you just said. And if you misspoke, that can be amplified on social media. It also means that, whoever you're talking with, whether it's fellow politicians or business leaders or, people from the community, I mean, you can't guarantee that people won't talk about it. In fact, you can guarantee that people will at some point, somewhere. Now, that doesn't always mean that people will be held accountable. I mean, we all remember famous political leaders saying really awful things off camera that gets out and they still get elected. So it's not necessarily a case of holding people accountable, but still, these are all examples of the few monitoring the many, right? Where the many monitor the few, I'm sorry. But even simple things like, it's almost impossible these days to do anything as a consumer that doesn't involve you being part of a synoptic surveillance relationship. How? Because every time you shop somewhere, every time you buy anything, whether it's a plane ticket or contact lenses or a book on Amazon, or it doesn't matter, you'll inevitably at some point get some email saying, would you mind filling in this survey? Would you mind rating your experience? Would you leave a comment, please, of how we did? Constantly. I mean, and that's just online. Offline, you get that kind of, you're being asked to that kind of surveillance work all the friggin' time. And again, this is a form of surveillance where, in a way, we monitor the few. We monitor the restaurants that we eat at. We monitor the shops we buy our stuff at. We monitor the airlines that we fly with. While at the same time, this is an example also of panoptic surveillance, because all these commercial entities have found a way to monetize on something we were already doing, namely having an opinion about our experience. Let's monetize that. Let's entice people to fill in a survey, to leave a couple of stars or some kind of ratings, because that's valuable data. So that's synoptic surveillance, where the many monitor or observe or survey the few. And then you have omnoptic surveillance. And that's what's happening right now in front of you, right? Where we all keep an eye on each other and everybody can keep an eye on everybody. I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to ask yourself, what kind of surveillance rituals have you come up with your friends? And what do I mean? Well, let's say tonight you're agreeing with a couple of people, maybe the people you're going to do the video with for this course, to meet in a bar somewhere in Amsterdam if you're in the city. Do you have some kind of protocol on when the meeting becomes more intimate or not? For example, then when you will be very publicly putting your phone face down on the table, or perhaps not even putting your phone on the table at all to indicate, well, this is a special occasion. This is when only you and I are important and nobody else that could come to us through this is welcome. Or when it doesn't really matter, especially when you meet people you don't really know that well, or for work, you just plunk this thing in a table, basically saying, you better be interesting because I could be there in a second. So, you know, be funny, be special, be precise, be something. I don't know if that's the case. We all have different ways of doing this. We all have different rituals. Some of us have never thought about this. That may be so, but I still bet you do have these rituals, even if you've never thought about them, perhaps especially if you've never thought about them. Why do I say that? Because all of that speaks to omnoptic surveillance, right? Surveillance that is just a banal, mundane, everywhere thing, just this phenomenon that we're all engaged in, that yes, we are subject to, but also that we do. And the reason why this taxonomy of panoptic, synoptic, omnoptic surveillance is important is first and foremost to make us all appreciate that, yes, it's incredibly important to be critical of surveillance and what it may or may not do to us and how it's enacted by people who have power over us. It is also, and I would argue equally important, to recognize our own participation in it. And how surveillance is a very complicated, layered concept. So, and then I think a second thing that is really interesting is that one thing you're gonna notice when you're studying media, when you're doing media studies, is that surveillance is a powerful, a fairly powerful theme in our field of study. You'll encounter it in other courses, in other fields of literature, in the books and articles you're going to be reading and studying for the next couple of years. So you'll see a lot of scholars, philosophers, media theorists have written extensively about surveillance, have theorized its consequences. And I would encourage you to always ask, when you read something like that, somebody's going on and on about surveillance, what are they exactly talking about? And what is my own role in this? So I'm not saying because you are part of it, you're not allowed to critique it. Of course not. I'm just saying that surveillance is not a sort of weird, just like media, not this weird external thing that happens to you. No, it's a fairly mundane thing that we're all part of. And that perhaps sort of brings a bit more nuance to our debate. And look, that's the whole point of this course, right? To bring a little bit more complexity and nuance to all the debates that we're having, that we're already having about media and information in our lives. So, and as people are saying in the chat, and I think that's a great point, you know, there's been a lot of debate this last year or so about something that some people, especially in the US, are calling cancel culture. Right? Is that when there's a lot of consternation about what somebody, especially somebody in the public eye, is doing, and saying, well, he or she has done this, so they should be canceled or they should be held accountable. I mean, the Me Too phenomenon, #MeToo, where people, especially women, would come forward and document sexual harassment in mostly the entertainment industry, but also other sectors of society. This is a great example of our friend John Thompson's comment about, how everything is visible now. And secondly, it had consequences, right? Some would argue not nearly profound enough, and others would say, well, too much. That's a different discussion. The point is that this was a great example of sort of synoptic surveillance, where the many were monitoring the few, and also omnoptic surveillance. So apparently, when something is happening to you in your work or at school or somewhere, people document it one way or another, and then may share it later. So you're part of surveillance at all times, at least potentially. Anybody you meet these days is quite likely to carry a device with them, even if you can't see it, that is more powerful than the most powerful computer was only 20 years ago, right? That has, 3 HD cameras built in, that is always connected online, that is, incredibly powerful surveillance instrument. And it's one that we wield. So surveillance as both a sometimes scary and critical issue, but also something very banal, very mundane, very, it's just a part of the life of a public life, right? That our lives have become in this media environment. So that's sort of by way of introducing this concept. And with that said, I'm opening. We're going on today until 4:45 in my time. So just stopping a little bit early, just that so that all of you know. Questions, comments about this or about anything else we have a lot of really cool stuff, at least I think so, that we can read this week. We can talk about movies that you could have seen, like the Minority Report, for example. Stuff from other weeks is fair game as well, of course. Barbara, you have your hand up.
As we mentioned, like Poland and Hungary and all these kind of Eastern European countries where the government has really strict policies for media.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, what should people do if they want to send another message which goes against the government's policy? Because like in the 21st century, you share everything on media, but what if you want to have another message? How do you find it? You make posters or what can be like an option?
What do you mean if you want the other type of message not using social media, or?
Yeah, I mean, if it goes against like the government's policy,
right,
and they just ban you. I'm from Hungary, so that's why I'm really curious about it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I want to make note though that obviously politically there are things happening in different parts of the world, like for example in Brazil or in Hungary or in other countries that are or in China, for example, that are perhaps a bit more overtly repressive than, for example, here in the Netherlands or in the US. But I want to say that we are all experiencing to some extent a kind of a repressive move. I've signaled in the beginning of today's meeting how governments all over the world are increasingly enacting and coming up with policies and laws regarding media. And there is a distinct repressive bent to all of this. And yes, in some countries it's more explicit than others. But the reason why I'm saying this, I want to prevent that, for example, if you're from Scandinavia or from the Netherlands or from England or from Australia or something, that you're pointing to Hungary or to China or to Brazil and saying, well, the people over there, that's a horrible, repressive regime, and I'm free. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. And it's so that's Of course, there are unique differences, and we need to be careful and unpacking and studying those. But there is a repressive move going on everywhere, and my personal hypothesis would be that speaks to the power we all attribute to media. Like we all feel that media have become an incredibly powerful force in society and everyday life, and those in power obviously feel the need to do something about that. So that in itself is an interesting sort of global phenomenon. That said, your question, let's say you're in a part of the world and you want to protest a specific phenomenon, but you know that if you do that on, the country's dominant social media platforms or online forums, you're going to be tracked and monitored and documented and may even be picked up and thrown in jail if you're not careful. So what options do you then still have to spread the word, to spread your message? And this is, actually, I really, really love that question, Barbara. So thanks so much for asking that, because I've noticed that teaching this course, and I've been teaching this course in one way or another for at least 15 years, is that this topic of activism, of using media, not just, to find cool new TV series or cool new games, but to express yourself, to change something in the world, either in your community or in your country or on a specific issue, is felt very strongly and very deeply by our students, by people in general, but especially by you. And I've never really dedicated specific sections of this course to that topic, but as you know, because you've read the first chapter, I'm writing a book now that eventually will be used in this course and in other universities around the world. At least that's what my publisher thinks. But activism will be a huge part of that book. And because it's obviously something that students bring to their university experience. Like, you want to make a difference, you want to change the world. So what role do media play in this? A long-winded way to come to your question. How can you use different kinds of media to further your goal of changing the world one way or another? Especially if some of these media, you can predict that they're going to be monitored and tracked by the very systems or people or actors that you probably want to either change or get rid of. And the history of media activism actually teaches us some really great lessons here, which is that if you use media for your activism, always use the media ecosystem rather than a specific media platform. What does that mean? It means that if you only use Twitter, or if you only use a Facebook group to rally people behind your cause, and make announcements, to exchange messages, to coordinate, to organize, then you're actually really vulnerable, right? Because you're vulnerable to changes in the policies and algorithms of that particular platform. You're vulnerable to whatever kind of, for example, state or security forces might be monitoring you because you're making it easy for them. You're vulnerable to, let's say, policies of certain organizations that require people to participate, that they not be anonymous, which would be a prerequisite for people to participate freely, especially when it comes to protest. So, and there are multiple ways around this. First of all, you can still use these platforms, but then use it anonymously. For example, by using virtual private networks, VPNs, like the University of Amsterdam has one called Pulse. And that's one way to anonymize your participation. You can, for most platforms, there are alternate versions online that you can find. Telegram, Signal are some examples of platforms like that. There's a really important role and contemporary activism throughout, for example, the African continent teaches us this. For other media, community radio is an incredibly powerful tool to reach people, to inform people about what's going on. Most successful larger campaigns still also produce print media. In fact, I was reading up the other day about the history of the worldwide struggle for women's right to vote. As all of you know or should know, it wasn't that long ago where women were not allowed to vote in most, if not all, countries around the world, including this one right here, the Netherlands. And that didn't change because men all of a sudden thought this was a good idea, right? No, 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 no. Men never thought this was a good idea. It's changed because women started organizing and campaigning for their right. And that started it started in the 18th century, but accelerated in the 19th century. So decades and decades and decades of struggle to fight for your right, your human right to vote, and not just to vote, but to participate in all aspects of democratic life. And one of the most powerful explanations of why this movement eventually became successful was the fact that they made their own media. Right? They printed their own newspapers and magazines and pamphlets and posters. And these turned out to be tremendously powerful. So I say that to not only remind us that using media for social change is not only a widespread phenomenon now, it has always been. Secondly, that successful strategies tend to involve multiple media. And within those strategies, you have different tactics to either use them anonymously or to use different media for different purposes. And of course, to combine analog and digital media, make it much harder for anybody to control and track anything that's going on across all these devices and platforms. So those are some things that I've learned from studying this topic for the next iteration of this class and for my book. But I'm always happy to talk about this topic because it's such an important part of living information. So thanks, Barbara. I really appreciate it. I hope my answer gave you a little bit. I want to go to Mustafa. You have your hand up.
Yeah, I had a quick question because you said that with media that it's been kind of taking us back, like it's not allowing us to progress as much, but don't you think that there's also the good in it outweighs the bad? Like the reading we had to do this week where it was talking about how it connected families together, and it really depends on if you use it as a supplement or not.
Right.
So what would you say, like, is there like a chance to kind of save how we're going with how we view media and use it every day, or is it like not changeable at all?
Thanks, Mustafa. Appreciate that question. And I think you point to something really fundamental that I just want to reiterate. I talked about it a little bit the first time around, but I don't think I can talk about it enough, which is this notion that, we would love to know as human beings, as students, as scholars, that this thing that we're studying, this object, whether it's the media in general or a specific platform or a specific way of people using something, watching TV, playing games, whatever it is, we have a natural tendency, an understandable tendency to want to know, is this okay, or is this really problematic, and B, where the hell is this going, right? And I consider it a goal for this particular course, but I think also for your mindset as a student or as a scholar, as a researcher, to try to, yes, acknowledge that that's a feeling you have, and then to, of course, question, why do you have that specific feeling? Why would you be worried about X, Y, or Z, right? Our worries about things generally come forth out of personal anxieties that we have. And second, to see if you can move beyond it and to look at whatever you're studying with, not objectively, because I don't think that's possible, but at least with a sense of wonder, like, what's actually going on here? That's kind of odd. Why are people doing that? And why are they doing it this way? And also, so in other words, when we project things into the future, when we try to formulate an hypothesis or an expectation of where things may be going, It's like, well, they're not going to get worse or better. They're going to change. That's for sure. And that change is going to be interesting. And it's going to be complicated. And it's going to depend on different people doing different things in different contexts. And so all of that should constantly help us to raise these kind of questions. So if and I think rightfully ask, well, I mean, things may not be going better. There's a lot of things to worry about. On the other hand, you see, for example, from the literature this week, that there are some really interesting sort of developments where media really contribute to, for example, family life or feeling connected in older age, in a later life phase. Well, I mean, then that just speaks to the complexity of this, right? That it's not either or. It's not either getting worse or getting better. It's like both. And I mean, I find a realization like that personally quite empowering. It feels like, I guess I have a role to play in this. I'm not here to teach you everything is going to hell in a handbasket. Right? I'm not here to say, well, it's surveillance and it's automation and it's evil artificial intelligence and algorithms and data is running your life and, abandon all hope, jump ship, start swimming. No, of course not. I'm also not here to say, you know what, sooner or later, the whole world will be connected. We'll all be holding virtual hands online, living in Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, and everything will be fine and wars will be a thing of the past. And no, that's also not going to happen. It's going to be a little bit of both. and that's nice, right? There's stuff to do still. There's no definitive answers to any of this. There are some trends, there are some developments, and certain groups of people want things to turn out in a certain way. And our job is to document that and to ask the questions, so why would they want that? What's their spiel? What's their agenda? How does that agenda expressed in specific media? That is interesting. That's a fun question. I'm realizing, Mustafa, that I'm not giving you a direct answer, but kind of an indirect one, encouraging you to do what you just did with the literature, is to see evidence for different possible futures. And I think that's the smartest way to read literature, not as a document about this is the way it is, but as examples of this is what could be. And that's a kind of I like that. That's a positive. That to me, that brings energy rather than takes it away.
I just have one more follow-up question.
Yeah.
So if people are kind of right now, they're concerned with the usage, our media usage, because they say because of how toxic some media platforms are and the posts and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't it be better if instead of people going, let's try to stop the usage of media, because that's going to be impossible right now because it's basically a habit.
Right.
Wouldn't it be better to kind of bring people in, indulge them more into it, but in a way that's positive? Let's say the surveillance and all that, if it got taken down or altered into a way where it actually impacts people in a positive way,
mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that be a better ideal situation, or would that still be kind of bad surveillance?
No, I think that's a very powerful sentiment, Mustafa. I think that's really good. I think that what that does is it opens up a conversation. It reminds me of something that really changed my way of looking at all of this, and it really inspired me, and I sense it in your comment as well, which is it was an interview with a very famous biologist from Chile called Humberto Maturana. And he came up with a very powerful theoretical concept in the 80s that won all kinds of awards, and it really changed the field of biology forever. The details of that are not important right now, but at some point he was interviewed about the role of technology in people's lives and in society, and aren't we losing touch with the natural world because of all this technology, and what are we supposed to be doing now? And the answer he gave in that interview, I thought was just so beautiful. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting, maybe I could look it up, I'll just share it with you right now. But he said something like, look, the question about where we're going with humanity or technology isn't either or. It isn't either, you know, humanity and nature or technology and machines. The question that we have is, what do we want from this world? And how are we going to take responsibility for it? And I think that's a beautiful sentiment. It speaks to exactly what you're saying. Look, you know, the rabbit is out of the hat. We're not going to stop using social media or some kind of social media. We're not going to stop expressing ourselves. Hate speech is never going to go away. Neither is people finding love and support online, or, you know, so it's not going to stop. However, it doesn't mean it has to be the way it is now, or it doesn't have to be toxic or whatever. It could be very empowering and emancipatory and all that. And the question is, you know, what do we actually want? What kind of world do we want in this digital environment? If we're going to be living in the metaverse, which I think is quite a likely prediction, well, how should it look like? Should it look like the way Neil Stephenson in his science fiction book Snow Crash from 1992 originally envisioned it, right? The metaverse as some kind of deeply depressing corporate, you know, hellscape? Or could it also be something that is, you know, illuminating and that teaches us about, you know, different people and different ways of doing things, and that, you know, perhaps even bring us closer together? I mean, that's entirely possible, but it depends on asking these kinds of questions. What is it I actually, when I go online, what do I want? Do I want, you know, get into a good fight? All right, let's make sure that there are going to be platforms for those kind of people. It's a valid feeling to have. I mean, I just don't want to be confronted by it all the time whenever I open my Twitter account. And if most people, which I would guess, would like, you know, just people posting interesting or funny or provoking things in a nice way, then, you know, let's come up with ways, systems and rules and protocols that enable that. So there's those kind of perspectives to really embrace. And for us as scholars, again, there's this delicate balance between our own normative biases, you know, what do we want, what do we think is good or bad, and then studying what people are actually doing, and trying to keep these two things, you know, as far as it's possible, separate. And for this course, really focus on the question, what is it that people are actually doing? That is the purpose of this course, and learning as much as we can from asking that question. Thanks, Mustafa. Really, really inspiring thoughts that you were sharing there. Anya, you've had your hand up for quite a while.
Yeah, hi. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I just wanted to add on to what Barbara had to say and ask a question as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm from India, and we actually recently had a policy for governing OTT platforms, basically content that is posted on maybe Netflix, Amazon Prime, or, you know, Z5, Hotstar. And the thing is that if the policy really hinders information freedom, as you mentioned in one of your lectures, right? So if people have a fear of, you know, publishing what they really want to express, then how is that solved by making policies that are that force them like against that?
If people, sorry, I didn't hear your last sentence. If people,
basically making policies that move people away from expressing themselves freely.
mm-hmm.
It's like freedom of thought, freedom of opinions, freedom of just expressing themselves the way they want to.
Mm-hmm. Well, so first of all, thanks for your question. And yeah, these recent actions in India again speak to this broader phenomenon that we see happening around the world, where policymakers of different kinds of governments are really pushing through at a fairly rapid pace policies, even laws, curtailing media, whether it's, you know, rules about media companies or rules about us and how we can express ourselves using media platforms and technologies. Second, what if you're part of a community or of a society where rules or protocols or laws are in effect that in effect make it harder for you to express yourself, to stand up for what you believe in, or to participate in the way that you feel is non-threatening to you or to the people you care about, to participate in civic life. I mean, what is to be done? Well, again, as media scholars, we should look at a couple of things simultaneously. On the one hand, we should carefully monitor and document what is actually happening in this space. What kind of policies are this? Who is enforcing them? How are they being enforced? On what kind of policies are these? Are they modeled? Right? There isn't a policymaker in the world that sort of independently invents a law. They're always modeled after existing jurisprudence or laws, also from other countries and other systems. So I think that that's an important field of investigation that sheds light on to what extent alternatives are possible too. Secondly, we should, and this is a very strong current in media studies, where we look at the grassroots level, like, okay, despite of, and sometimes even thanks to policies like that, people still find ways to express themselves, to organize, to do things differently. How are they getting away with this? Right? And Barbara's question very much spoke to that perspective. It's like, you know, if you know that certain platforms or outlets are monitored or tracked or controlled, how can you still express yourself? How can you still get organized? And then we know from the history of media activism, well, there's quite a few ways people are doing this and have been doing this throughout history, even at a time where repression of over half of the people in the Zoom chat right now was completely normal, including here in the Netherlands, like of women, for example. So it's not impossible. I'm always reminded of, you know, the two most often quoted philosophies in popular film. One is Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. The other one is Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, life will find a way, right? So people's self-expression will find a way. It always does. Not without consequences. I'm not naive, but it does. And there's an important role for us as scholars as well, as like to document what is actually happening. That's why I keep coming back to this issue. Like, don't forget to look at what people are actually doing, because it's never as neat and as perfect as people in power like to believe or tell you it is. So there's a second perspective on this. And thirdly, one development in media around the world that is particularly interesting to study in this context is something which in the literature we call diasporic media. I'm guessing most of you haven't heard of that concept. So what are diasporic media? I mean, diaspora is a word that you probably know. The diaspora talks about people who used to be part of the same community, lived in the same area, in the same country, but because of a variety of reasons, had to flee, had to spread. This could be because of economic reasons, like starvation, no jobs or whatever, or because of war and conflict, or because of oppression, because of you know, being hunted, being chased for their religion or for any other kind of reason. Anyways, people scatter all over the world. And what is happening, what has been happening, and especially in our digital age, in our online world, is that diasporic communities start their own media as a way to reconnect with each other and with wherever they came from. And sometimes these media become the most powerful media in the place or the country where they were, even though nobody is there anymore. I mean, a very famous example, often studied by media scholars, is a website called Malaysia Kini, which is a diasporic medium. It's a news site for news about and on Malaysia, written or filled by Malaysians that now live all over the world, that fled the country for, again, a wide variety of reasons. So diasporic media are a really interesting platform for news and information and voices in places in the world that, if you would express these voices there, you would be, would be very dangerous. So diasporic media is a really interesting sort of a third way of looking at all of this. And I'm going to add one more thing. I know I talk too much, but it's a powerful topic and I'm inspired by your questions. But one thing that colleagues and I and some of my graduate students and I have studied over the last couple of years has been journalists who used to work in their home countries but had to flee, again, for a variety of reasons, because of a repressive government, because the publication they worked for got shut down, because of other reasons, and setting up news services for and about their country from neighboring countries. And this happens all over the world. This happens in Africa, this happens in Latin America, this happens everywhere. It's not the same as diasporic media because these are professional journalists, but they start these kind of online media because, of course, it's relatively easy to do so. It's more safer to do so because they're not in their home country anymore. And they still have this passion, they feel this mission to keep informing people about what is really happening. And so this is a fascinating example, right? That on the one hand, we're in a media environment that makes it easier, especially for autocratic or dictatorial governments to control and to repress. The same media environment makes it easier to organize differently, to spread the word virally, to express yourselves in ways that cannot so easily be curtailed. So it's both, right? And I think that's a fascinating. And I'm not here to say that those journalists who have fled are equally powerful as the dictatorship that they fled from. Again, that's not an equal match. That's not an equal matchup. I do want to say, however, that I think it's our responsibility as media scholars to document as carefully the repression and how media are used for that goal, as well as the, for lack of a better term, liberation of the media environment, right? It is a never-ending struggle. Even in this country, in the Netherlands, which is supposedly a free media culture, which in several ways it is not. So there's an interesting struggle going on everywhere. The point is that media are apparently considered so important that all actors in society are constantly struggling over and about it. That should tell us something, right? So, so thanks for that question. Mandy, I think you had your hand up right from the start.
Hi, Professor Mark.
Hey.
So in lecture 5, you said the importance of wondering about the future of media. I have a question about the future of Zoom, because I find that it's hard to get like focus in the class because you can literally chat to anyone you want in the chat box and you can see yourself all the time. It's like constantly taking selfies. Do you know, is there any new technologies or new educational platforms that might have the possibility to replace Zoom in the future?
Mm. Oh, yes. Thanks, Mania. Yeah, you're making such a valid point. And I promise you, this is a never-ending discussion that we're having at the university, and not just at our university, at all universities, right? You know, should we continue to use Zoom? Should we rather use, I don't know, Microsoft Teams or any of those others? Or should we use, you know, programs where that look more like games? like a sort of a virtual environment where you're just an avatar or something like that. I mean, there's plenty of that. There's even 3D environments where you can sort of walk through and do that, or just text-based. Maybe we should go back to sort of the ancient sort of 1980s, early 90s web, where you would do, I don't know if anybody knows what MUDs are, multi-user domains. These were text-based virtual environments where you would type in commands or text and things would happen. And all of that is worthy of consideration. I mean, after this year, it's safe to say that all educational institutions are looking at a future where these things exist side by side, right? In-class things with hybrid, with online, with where everything sort of, I mean, I guess it's the next step towards the educational metaverse. And again, we should be mindful as media scholars of what is really happening here, right? I mean, what are people actually doing in these Zooms? Some aspects of these Zooms are really, really horrible, and some are lovely. And so it's neither good or bad what's happening here. It's very interesting. And I'll give you an example from this particular course. For the last couple of years, this course, I mean, our program in media studies has gotten quite popular. I mean, 5-6 years ago, I taught this class for about 120 students. Now we're 645. So something's going on, right? And our largest classroom on campus doesn't hold much more than 400 students. So without Corona, we won't fit into a lecture theater. So there's one very specific problem that's departments all over the world are increasingly having. The economy department here at our university does some of its courses in a massive theater downtown. Or does it with 7 parallel classrooms with 7 screens, and this was before Corona. So something needs to happen. And my experience is that what I really don't like is not seeing you and meeting you anymore. What I do like is actually getting to know you a bit better, because I would normally never know, your names or your faces if the only time I see you is in a massive lecture hall with 400 people. Like, this is not conducive to saying, hi, how's it? And learning what you care about and what you think about. So no matter what's going to happen in the future, I'm going to keep doing this. But we also have to go back to some kind of lecture form, and whether that will be video or video in a 3D kind of game-like environment, which could be very interesting. Like imagine Fortnite as a lecture hall, right? It's not a crazy thought. People organize dance parties and concerts in Fortnite. Why not education? It should be not a big problem. We just go massively in creative mode and create something truly awesome. I wouldn't mind lecturing to 500 orcs. That could be fun. And so, anyways, interesting again here. I think the questions that we need to ask is, technologically, almost anything is possible, but what is it that we actually want, right? What is it that we want from this, and how are we going to take responsibility for it? And that's a never-ending discussion. So your thoughts are increasingly important in this. I mean, especially outside of class. By all means, let your tutors, your mentors, your student coordinators, everybody, let them know what you would like, what you would like to see happen for your education or in general, because that will be tremendously important to us. And whatever we can come up with might be very different than what you can come up with. So thanks, Manny. I want to briefly go to the chat, because Darren and Bethany have raised some interesting issues coming out of the chat also on Canvas. And I'm going to refer to a comment that Darren made about the Canvas chat. He says that one of the students, Matt, raised the issue that this theory of panopticism that we've talked about briefly in the beginning of today's session. That's based on Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon. Seems to describe the underlying and invisible power structure of societies that we live in. We are all at times under surveillance by these power structures. My question is in how far we should be skeptical or critical about the surveillance. And I mean, that's actually quite a radical comment. That's why I wanted to highlight it briefly before we move on. Right. And look, I appreciate several of you send me messages, and some people express themselves on the Canvas chat like, hey, Mark, what should we take away from this Panopticon thing? Right. It's a massive document. And at some point I said, well, focus on the first 10 to 12 pages. But still, it's a long document. It's written in a kind of English that none of us are used to because it was written in the 17th century. And yeah, it's a guy writing a letter to his dad. Well, big whoop. What's the big deal about this? And I guess, and like what I said in the Canvas chat too, is obviously I don't want you to study this document in terms of that you're able to reproduce it or parts of it at some point. Absolutely not. It's almost like I want you to imagine that you're Jeremy, like you're visiting your brother who's working in Russia. Now, how did you travel to Russia in the 17th century, right? By boat and on horseback in a carriage or something. So there you are traveling for weeks and weeks and weeks to get there. I mean, a vast empty expanse. And you find that your brother is trying to coordinate work across a space that is absolutely massive, that he can't be everywhere at once. And then there's pressure from his client, the Tsar, to make it not just work, but to make it spectacular and to make it great. Right. So this was a really big deal. It was a sort of a thing that spoke to the Tsar's reputation at the time. And you have to come up with something truly amazing. And then he came up with this panopticon principle, this notion of how can you make sure that everybody does what they're supposed to do without you being able to stand over their shoulder and constantly tell them what they're supposed to be doing at all times. And he said, well, you just have to find a way to be there without being there. And that's the panopticon, right? It's surveillance without anybody actually doing the surveying. Bloody brilliant. And Foucault, our very dear French friend, wrote about this idea, these series of letters that Jeremy sent to his dad in England about what his brother was doing. He used this to say, well, exactly what Mats is saying in the Canvas chat. Wait a minute. That panoptic principle, or the inspection principle, right? The inspection principle means people feel they're inspected, but they're not necessarily are inspected. That's the inspection principle. That's actually how everything works. I mean, you can sort of sense, if you ever read Foucault, that he had this sort of aha moment, like, sitting in the bathtub, like, yeah, it's almost like I can see the matrix, right? I mean, it's like, this is how everything works. Why would people always do what they're supposed to be doing? Well, because in part, they feel they're monitored all the time. And if they step out of line, that this has consequences. Now, at the heart of this is not a big revelation, right? We're social animals. All of us, generally speaking, like to be part of something. We like to be part of a family or a group of friends or a community, of a place. And so a huge chunk of the energy in our life goes to figuring out that. How do we belong? How do we fit in? How do we, are part of this? And that you do that by observing others, right? Kids learn by, you can tell a child 100 times to do or not do something. A child will learn by looking at what you're doing. I find it really funny in the debates about screen time with parents and kids, like how many hours should my child be on the iPad? Well, how many hours are you? I mean, if you're at the dinner table complaining about your kids spending so much time on their phones and you're eating dinner while also texting your friends, well, what do you think they're going to be picking up? What you're telling them or what you're showing them? No, of course, what you're showing them. So inspection is a fundamental property of how we live together, with or without media. However, the moment communities get so big that we can't observe everybody at the same time anymore, we need something else. And I told you, I think at the last session, that some people suggest that the first medium to be used for that purpose was language. Like the reason why we have language is actually as a form of surveillance, is to keep track of everybody, to communicate, this is who you are, this is what you're supposed to be doing, right? Rather than throwing shit at each other like monkeys do, you say, well, can you tell John to put the trash out tomorrow? And John lives on the other side of the community. Okay, that's language, that's a medium. But now our societies have become so massive, so complex, we need something else. And that's where panopticism comes in, right? So when you sort of scale up surveillance to a societal level. So you create institutions like schools, like churches, like the church, I'm sorry, like, or religion, I should say, like the army, like, you know, offices of companies. And all of these institutions really have the same function, is to remind you who you are and how you're supposed to act, or how you fit in. And this is all Foucault speaking, right? What I'm saying here now. So yes, in a way, this is what runs underneath everything. But what I love about Matt's point is you know, should we be skeptical and critical about this? I mean, it serves a fundamental human purpose, right? It keeps society, generally speaking, running. And I think that's a really good question to ask. I mean, the problem with surveillance is perhaps not so much surveillance itself. The problem is how it's used, right? Is it used to repress and to suppress and to control and discipline, as a lot of theorists have suggested, like Foucault, like Gilles Deleuze, like Armand Matelar? You don't have to remember these names. You'll be exposed to them sooner or later in our field of study. Or is it also something that really contributes to you know, a better and perhaps more just society? You know, if we're seen, that means we're recognized and we can be part of something. We have a voice. And as I also mentioned in the video, I mean, surveillance only works if we participate in it. And that also gives us power, right? That's why the taxonomy, Panoptic, Synoptic, Omnoptic surveillance is so important. It reminds us that we do the surveillance too. So that is a really powerful point, and I appreciate that was made in the. Okay, I'm talking. George, you had your hand up for a long time. Go, dude.
Good. Okay, I've muted. I've everything.
University of Amsterdam sweatshirt.
Yeah, of course. So I have two things. First thing is, like, why do you think that the UK and Western countries weren't put under that much fire when they started doing like stuff related to privacy? Because like the UK had that thing with asking WhatsApp to put a backdoor in their encryption, for example, and like, except for tax savvy people, nobody knew that, but everybody knows about China or about Eastern Europe, about stuff like that. And that's one of the things. And the other ones is like, how should I say this? Like, the fact that, do you think that the fact that we most of us speak a common language nowadays all across Europe helps in the like transmission of like facts that you probably shouldn't know? Like, for example, with Alexander Navalny from Russia and all the stuff that he done. Now he's in jail and almost fucking dead because the Russians did that to him. And like, without him having subtitles in English, and access to the worldwide internet, nobody would have known all those things about Russia because they're very well covered up. So those are my like two questions.
Well, first of all, And I totally second your observation. I'm always just baffled, if not irritated by, for example, Dutch news media running stories about, China's social credit surveillance system. As if, I mean, actually, the surveillance apparatus in the Netherlands is far more advanced than in China. Let's not forget, about half of the population of China is not online. Little less than half, but still, we're talking about extraordinary amount of people. Whereas in the Netherlands, almost 98% of people are online, and we are all being monitored, right? So, and this has consequences, this monitoring. And the Dutch security system is largely uncontrolled. Like, I mean, there's only a handful of tech journalists in the Netherlands that actually follow this stuff. So the naivete or the arrogance of speaking about how horrible the surveillance is in another part of the world, especially in a non-Western, non-white part of the world, is profoundly problematic. That doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong with the social credit system, and don't get me wrong, of course there is, but I mean, surveillance is everywhere. And it would be more interesting to document how surveillance in different cultures and different societies works and operates and what is actually happening, rather than pointing fingers and like, well, at least we don't have a law like in Hungary. No, but we have other ways of subtly controlling what broadcasters do, right? In the Netherlands, for example, 1/3 of the TV market is controlled by public broadcasters, right? And public broadcasters are paid, of course, through our tax money. So you would think, great, right? Independent public broadcasting, you have a mission to serve all of us. That's lovely, that's wonderful. But for the last, 15 years at least, we've had successive governments in the Netherlands that each government constantly threatens to cut the funding, and they do. Every couple of years, they cut funding to the public broadcasters. And while doing so, threatening to either cut the funding more or to even abolish the whole system altogether, because let the market figure it out. This is a constant weight on the shoulders of the people who run public broadcasting companies in the Netherlands. So no way in hell they're free. No way in hell they can do whatever they want. No, they have to be constantly mindful of this threat that the funding might be pulled underneath out of them like that, because that's the constant threat. Now that's not exactly free speech either. So we should be mindful of this everywhere, and not just at places that for us are far away, no matter what place that is. Just as the opposite, right? I mean, like if you visit your friends in China, or some of you maybe are from China, it's fairly common to then point to the US and saying like all the horrible things that are happening over there. And then, yeah, they are, but also in your own country, it's everywhere. So to look at how these things operate across cultures, across boundaries, how, and of course, the very interesting role of the media industry in all of this, because media industries tend to be global industries, right? They tend not to be specific to any time or place. They operate in different countries and different cultures, often having to tweak their settings for specific places, like Google does in China, for example. So that is interesting to study and to appreciate and to document. And then exactly what you're saying, George, we can be very critical, and we should be, about the fact that we expect everybody to express themselves in English, and that English is the lingua franca, for example, online, even though the majority of the world doesn't speak English. And this is absolutely problematic. On the other hand, it does facilitate the exchange of information and of data and of ideas, and to contribute to making them spread more globally. And for most people, I would assume most of us, this is a good thing. Of course, that also means that some ideas spread that perhaps we don't like as much, but you can't open the door and don't expect sometimes people coming in that you really don't want to have visit. That kind of happens when you keep the door open. So but it doesn't mean that it's just all great. I mean, one thing I've learned from having had the privilege of traveling for my work and teaching in different parts of the world, and having had my work translated in different languages, is that, you know, when I go to Brazil to teach, or to Portugal, I realized not only like, hey, I didn't know some of my work was translated in Portuguese, but that there's an incredibly rich wealth of Portuguese language scholarship on all these issues that I didn't know about, because I mean, a lot of colleagues over there don't necessarily publish in English. The same goes for Francophone countries, or for Spanish countries, for people who speak Mandarin or Cantonese. So so there's still so much more to learn, and I think it's and then I'll shut up, but it's important for us as media scholars, and I speak now for my colleagues and myself, to be mindful when we assign literature, to not just assign, you know, white men from Europe and North America and the odd Australian, but to truly diversify. And I promise you, we and my colleagues, we talk about this all the time. We work incredibly hard on doing this, and for you to call us on it, right? To say, hey, Mark, nice, these reading assignments, but what about, you know, stuff from my country? What about, you know, can you please stop using the Avengers as an example, but use as an example this, you know, soap opera that is really popular in the Middle East, or this game that everybody in Venezuela is playing. And I would so appreciate that. I think it's part of, you know, acknowledging that our media culture is global, and that we have a responsibility to listen to everything and to learn from everything, because the phenomena we're studying are everywhere. So I just wanted to make that point following up from you. Tvitalina, you've had your hand up right from the beginning as well.
Yeah, just let me find my question. So my question is actually related to the first document we had to read about the relations of media and the generation of all people. So my question is why does email contact tend to increase for transoceanic relationship, while face-to-face contact is actually preferred when there is a smaller distance between people? I just don't understand it. If you're using basically your email when you're speaking with people over the ocean, but when people are around you, you use video chatting. Why is that? Why, when you're close by, you can see the people, and when you're transoceanic, you cannot see their faces.
You know, Svetlana, I think that's a research question. So there isn't a general sort of rule or law or explanation for why that would or wouldn't happen. I think this is a beautiful example of that. These kind of instances are dependent on context. It was interesting in the readings for this week, in the study that Annabel Konase did and her colleagues did in Canada. And I've assigned that reading specifically because I would love for you to remember her name, Annabel Konase, the main author. I mean, I think she's one of the most fascinating and brilliant scholars in our field in the world, and just yeah, really inspiring work. And if you want to go online on YouTube, there's an interview that I've done with Annabel that you can find there. I would recommend of you to watch, just to get to know her a little bit better. Where she speaks about this very issue that you're raising now, Svetlana. So that's a viewing tip, not a requirement, just a tip. But to your question, in that paper of hers, it was interesting how they said that, you know, yes, people in a later phase of life, older people, for lack of a better term, actually generally quite appreciate the role of media and ICTs in their life, especially if they use them a lot when they were younger. They feel more connected, they keep in touch with their friends, they actually are a vehicle for them to keep in touch with younger generations, with their kids and grandchildren. but ultimately they just want to hang out in person, right? They would prefer the human, the face-to-face contact. And so that is interesting, that and it doesn't mean that face-to-face contact is inevitably better, a better form of communication. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. I mean, it depends on the people, on the context, the situation. And the way we look at that in media studies is to, in every situation, to look at the distinction between, on the one hand, what we call affordances of media. And then, of course, something I've been reiterating constantly these last couple of weeks is the actual uses of media, right? And affordances is a term that comes out of the field of psychology, actually, psychology and design. And what it means is that any technology affords us to do certain things with it. Like, I mean, with this thing, we can do an X number of things, and some things we cannot do with this. With a television, you can do these things, but not everything. With a computer, and so on and so forth. With this piece of software, you can do these 12 things, but not these other things. So everything you can do with a piece of technology is called its affordances. And so how do we afford ourselves of these options? And you may remember the last time I said that most media innovation doesn't happen because of some brilliant entrepreneur inventing something, but because we not using media the way they're supposed to. And then companies figuring out maybe we should then redesign our media so that it fits more with what we actually do. And that speaks to this affordances thing, is that media afford us certain opportunities to either just text, or to text with audio, to text or to video, or to just talk on camera, or all these kind of options. And we have, for different situations and different contexts, different preferences. Why? Why with video in this situation, but not in that situation? Has it to do with the technology? Has it to do with, the meaning of the situation, if it's a business meeting or a date or something else? Has it to do with how you feel that morning, like bad hair day? That never happens to me. Right, it's different situations, different contexts produce different ways of using media, which, and that's my final thought on this, should also remind us that media are not always the same, right? I mean, for different people, they mean different things. They are used for different reasons, and they fulfill different functions. So there's never one way of looking at media. That would be impossible. There's no one theory of media either, other than that media are pervasive and ubiquitous and getting more complicated all the time. I mean, I think that's a fairly common assumption. But other than that, your question would be best tested in a research environment. Alexandra, you had a question right from the beginning as well.
Yeah, hi. I'm not sure if it's as interesting as what we've talked about before. And also, I may be completely wrong with what I'm about to say. But last week, we made a point about how we are never going to get less media. It's only going to accumulate. And that made me think about our current culture of media consumption and how it's very centered on optimization. I mean, we all want to consume as much content, and we also want it to be good at that in as little time possible. And I mean, even personally, I cannot imagine nowadays watching a YouTube video on regular speed because there's so much that I want to catch up with. It's automatic at twice as fast as the least for me personally. So keeping that in mind, I also started thinking about how we have this resurgence of I guess the topic of wellness, and how my generation is currently living through this new age revival type of thing. And I know a lot of it has also, it has a lot to do with the mere aesthetics of it, with the crystals and the positive affirmations, and that usually the target and also the creators of this content are usually young women. But then again, older millennials have been massively consuming and also creating similar content as well. But it was more focused on minimalism and Marie Kondo and also like the making like Eastern philosophies more mainstream, as well as meditation. So I guess like I was wondering if somehow, because of our overly optimized culture of consuming media, we have shifted to consuming content that at least makes us feel as if we're maybe a little bit more in control, or like decluttered, or like part of a bigger picture. And this idea of wellness has become like, it used to be a niche, and now it has become mainstream. And even with like Netflix recently, I think they produced their own series of guided meditations or something like that. So I guess that's my question.
It's certainly not uninteresting at all. So thanks for that question. When you were talking, I was reminded of, I don't know if this is a thing for you guys and girls. It might be, I mean, that I find this funny, but Bo Burnham making that song "White Woman's Instagram." I don't know. So if you don't know it, just Google it. I thought it was very funny, but it kind of speaks to this too. This sort of, that everybody's on Instagram expressing their own unique identity, and then a lot of people on Instagram have the exact same aesthetic going, with a lot of wellness and sort of, you know, things being all nice and soft and cuddly and lovely. And I would think, well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, as the Seinfeld episode goes. But I think your observation speaks to a couple of really interesting phenomena that we see in our global media culture. The replication of a certain aesthetic, going viral, if you will, and being co-opted. I mean, and there's different names for this. I mean, a couple of years ago, there was this whole discussion in the interior design and architecture movement about the Airbnb effect. Is that apartments on Airbnb increasingly look exactly the same, no matter whether you are in Stockholm or in Nairobi or in Lima. You're basically renting the same place that has sort of a uniform kind of aesthetic of that is sort of interchangeable, with here and there sort of a local accent, but also in part because that's what people like, but in part also because it needs to appeal to most people, and in part because it is then co-opted by corporations who use this for marketing and branding purposes. And so there's a delicate dance that is happening there, where media play, especially visual media, a very potent role. And which is the same with this aesthetic. It's also the same for activism, right? Networked activism that kind of looks and feels the same for different issues around the world, with, you know, a hashtag and a public demonstration and graffiti and you know, so that has sort of a kind of a look, which is just really fascinating. So that would suggest a sort of a universalizing or homogenizing tendency that is sort of embedded in our media culture, right? And this is a potent theory that you see sort of bandied about in the literature quite a lot in our field, right? Where you know, things are, I mean, 20 years ago, we would talk about Americanization or McDonaldization of things all becoming the same in media, and especially more American. Now, we know better. That's not really what's happening. In fact, quite the opposite is happening. I mean, a lot of film scholars today would argue that contemporary American film is increasingly co-opting, especially Asian or Japanese and Chinese design and aesthetic elements, or that especially popular Hollywood films are overall completely switching to an aesthetic that seems to be more inspired by video games than by, you know, something distinctly American. Furthermore, the majority of American films isn't made in America anymore. So that's also kind of an interesting corollary to that critique. So homogenization, or sort of a universalizing tendency of an aesthetic, of an idea, of a way of doing things. Yes. And here I go again. At the same time, things are becoming more particular, more local, more specific and more explicit. I think, and this is something that you read in the literature, for example, about activism a lot, is that the mistake that is often made in explanations of how people get involved with networked activism, activism that exists through hashtags online and all that kind of stuff, is that because media and technologies are involved, there is something similar about all the different ways people participate. And for people who study the phenomena more carefully, they would go, no, that is very, very wrong. Like a climate change protest in Stockholm actually is quite fundamentally different from one in Brazil or in Rio. And the one in Rio has different participants and a different dynamic and a different feel and often also a different political agenda than one in downtown Tokyo, and let alone the one here in Amsterdam. You know, different speakers, different slogans, different everything, even though they all come together because it says, you know, what is it, the Future Fridays hashtag. So I think it's really interesting is that the temptation we may have when we look at all these media around us, then when we participate in this media culture, is to see them as a universalizing agent in sort of, leveling everything, erasing the uniqueness, the particulars of different cultures and different ways of being, which to some extent is right, and to a large extent actually is profoundly incorrect. Sometimes it becomes harder to see the particular if you're only looking at the media representation of it. And sometimes it's the exact opposite. That something seems really unique to this particular event right here, right now. But if you then zoom out and you look how it works in media, there's actually something that really connects people elsewhere. And as a final thought about that, again, related to activism, what I found really interesting in that literature too, that we may take away from that for the purposes of our course, is that this messiness, this complexity, right, where phenomena we see happening in media look kind of similar all over the world, as seem to connect us, seem to perhaps reduce the uniqueness of all the different people and groups and communities that are part of this. Whereas at the same time, if you look more carefully at what is actually happening, there are still very unique and context-dependent things going on all over the place. That would suggest, well, that's so complex. There's so much going on at the same time. How can you even make sense of that anymore? How could anything actually work? How can you find meaningful stuff in this clutter, right? That actually contributes to its strength, right? That actually is the power of our contemporary sort of media and information culture, our networked environment, that its complexity and its messiness is actually what keeps it alive. That if things were much more clear and much more sort of, if it was much more easy to compartmentalize, to box in, well, this is something that happens in the Netherlands and that happens in China, you know, done. But that just doesn't work. Like, you know, yes, the government in Hungary may come up with a law that makes it really hard for its main critical TV station to keep broadcasting the way it does. Hey, they can try. But does that mean that people in Poland won't get access to critical news anymore? Hell no. In fact, people might even get more access to that kind of news because now they become curious. Why is the government so upset about this network? Hey, my friends are on this sort of VPN, and through that you can get some other information. I want to know what's going on. Now, I'm being wildly optimistic right now, but it is interesting that the very complexity of the system is its strength rather than its weakness. That's a lovely insight that you can only get by studying this kind of stuff carefully. And that's what I would encourage. The next student, Yelisaveta, is that, do I pronounce it correctly? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Elizaveta.
Yelisaveta, lovely. Hi, your question, please.
Hi, Mark. So when you talked about surveillance and anonymous app, I remembered one case that happened in 2018. So generally, Central Intelligence Agencies of Australia and USA cooperated. Right after 2 apps for anonymous chatting were banned. And so they came up with the idea to create like app for anonymous chatting. And they took 2 detectives who hid their identity and advertisement those apps for like drug dealers. And they convinced one Australian drug dealer to like full reliability of this app. So he started using this app, and then he also convinced other drug dealers. And right after like half a year, they arrested around 2,000 people and like confiscated 3 tons of drugs. So how in this way we can trust anonymous apps and like be careful with it in terms of media?
Yeah, thanks so much for that example. Yeah, how can we trust anything? It really depends from what perspective you want to answer that question, right? From a cybersecurity point of view, we can't trust anything, right? I mean, and that's the whole point of critique of surveillance societies, is that, I mean, the moment you touch anything on any device that has a computer chip in it, this get logged and stored somewhere. I mean, there is the delete key on your keyboard is an illusion. Especially now with cloud computing, it just means that your stuff is stored on a computer somewhere else. So so in that sense, you can't trust anything. Everything is subject to observation. On the other hand, and that's why I say it depends, what did we learn about surveillance this week? We learned that surveillance is exactly powerful, not as an actual phenomenon that happens to us, but as an inspection principle. In other words, as our assumption that anything we do will be monitored by somebody somewhere. And that is what makes surveillance powerful. Now, luckily for most of us, surveillance doesn't really do all that much, other than, in the best case scenario, give you just a little bit better recommendations when you're browsing Netflix. Although that's not really helpful either. If you got a lot of good, I don't know about you, but I don't know how many evenings I've spending an hour scrolling to Netflix and then just abandoning the thing altogether because I couldn't make a decision. Perhaps that says more about me than you. But anyways, a well-working surveillance algorithm isn't always your friend. And let's not forget that the problem we have to find the right kind of information about anything or anyone is about 1 billion times bigger for any agency or company collecting data. Right? I mean, there isn't a human being that is looking at any one of us. There isn't. It's software, right? Because human beings wouldn't be able to do that. There's just too much information. And this is actually really interesting. I mean, there's 2 names that I've mentioned before, 2 famous media philosophers that have really written a lot about this. The one is, of course, Michel Foucault, who came up with the idea of panopticism based on Jeremy Bentham's letters to begin with. And then one of his later colleagues, Gilles Deleuze. And they had very different perspectives on this, even though they used the same concept of that surveillance is powerful when you think you're being watched. And Deleuze makes a really interesting point. He says, look, and then I'm translating and paraphrasing. If you're very familiar with Deleuze's work, you're probably going to find fault with the way I'm doing that. Like many other French philosophers, both Foucault and Deleuze are hard to read and make sense of sometimes. There are explanations for that I don't have time to go into right now, but so bear with me. But Deleuze's point is actually about when it comes to surveillance, fairly simple and fairly interesting. He says, look, the point is not so much that there's these agencies, there's security services or states or whatever that collect all data about you, right? About you, Maria, or about you, Alexandra, or about you, Darren, or about you, Nicole, and that they know you. It's like, no, that's actually not what's happening. What is happening is that in a lot of different ways, data is gathered about you by a lot of different agencies and actors, some of them companies and commercial, some of them institutional, some of them governmental, all of them governed by software, right? The way they get that data is through software. And so there's bits of you all over the place, chunks of information. And then, yes, some governments, some surveillance and security agents try to combine all these bits and pieces. So what is really happening in what is truly happening in surveillance is that we are constantly taken apart and put back together again, without any human intervention. There's no single human being actually taking bits and pieces of you and putting it, you know, in an Excel sheet and like that. No, software does that. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried to work on a document with a couple of people and sending each other different versions of the document for a while, at some point shit gets lost, or the document becomes corrupted and it starts acting weird, your computer crashes, you have to start from scratch, you have to move, whatever it is, it becomes a mess. It's inevitable. And that's just one document shared by, let's say, 3 people. What about a computer that's trying to put you together with about 12,625 different sources of data, all of them coming from as many different types of platforms and software services and data banks and databases and server farms and computers and mobile devices and so on and so forth? You can predict what's going to happen. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a nightmare. And that's what we're hearing all the time. Right? I mean, the danger of surveillance is not so much that everybody's being watched. The danger is that you show up in the airport trying to board your flight and mistakenly you end up on some kind of ridiculous no-fly list. The danger is that you're applying for a mortgage and for some messed up reason, the banks have decided that you are not worthy of credit because somebody with an identity number that looks like you, or somebody at some point made a typo somewhere, or some computer messed up, but now you can't get a mortgage, or not the mortgage you want. I mean, that's the real danger. And Deleuze calls that we have become in/individuals, like we are constantly divided, and in the process, of course, our humanity gets lost. And what I love about this is that it reminds us that our concern about surveillance to some extent is driven by ego. Because, oh yes, we don't want people to watch us. But underneath that is like, they're watching me. I'm important. And like what we really have to let go of is that idea. You are not special. Nobody gives a damn about you. No computer, no camera, no company, no state, nobody. What they care about is your data, parsed, cut to pieces, put together with other data, and coming up with profiles that reduce the complexity for the way they function, for the way they market stuff at us, the way they provide certain services, for example, for at what time of the day they should pick up the trash in our neighborhoods. So surveillance isn't Big Brother, right? Because Big Brother really was an appeal to our ego. surveillance is messy, it's complicated, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, and that perhaps is its problem. But maybe I'm going a bit too far here. But what is really interesting, and all this comes from simply looking at surveillance carefully. What is it? What is actually happening? What is people are actually doing with this data? And yes, it is a truly universal system. And yes, in a way, we can't trust anything anymore, any app or device or platform that we're using. On the other hand, take a deep breath. You know, some of that wellness stuff is really useful here. You know, take a deep breath, chill out, relax, lean backwards, and just ask a simple question. So what are they actually doing? What's really happening? And I'm just still thinking about playing YouTube videos that at double the speed. It never occurred to me that that's how I could save time. Oh, it's brilliant. It's honestly, I never thought about that. That's great. So thanks. I promised that I would end a little bit early. If you're in Amsterdam and you look outside, the sun is shining. I think we should go and get some fresh air. One last question, Maria. You've been on top of my list for such a long time. Oh, I can't hear you. Oh no. What's happening? Yeah, your microphone is on, but I don't hear you. Can anybody else hear our friend? No. Can you try again? Ah, no. Or you can type your question in the chat. Okay, we'll do two questions then, because I want to come back to Maria when she's figured out. Jules, you wanna pitch in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So I have a question basically. So we live in this super modern world where we have social media, which means I can be connected to anyone in the world to take part in whatever activist fight I want.
Yes.
Like, for example, I can take part of global warming and fight against it, or the working conditions for the factories that produce the iPhone. But I feel like all this power we have in social media is also a feeling of a false sense of action. Because a lot of people are going to take part in their fight by just uploading a story on Instagram, or for example, just like during Black Lives Matter, uploading a black picture, which is, for me, I think, really sad, since we have all these tools of communications, but we do not share a real information. The black picture is not information. So I just wanted to know if it's, first of all, a real phenomenon, and also if it is linked to some kind of social desirability. Since people are going to try to, well, I'm going to share this post just for people to know, like, oh yeah, he's taking part in it.
Thanks, Jules. That's really good. That's an important observation right there. I mean, I had to think when you were saying about that black square for Black Lives Matter. The story of a friend of mine. She was telling me that last year at some point her daughter became really upset with her because she hadn't made her Facebook profile page black. And it's like, you should make it black. What's wrong with you? Are you a racist? And it's like, what's wrong? What's happening? She had no idea what was going on. But that's Black Lives Matter, you know, power and all that. And okay. And then so she made her image black because otherwise her daughter would be upset. So is that real activism, or is that just, you know, parents trying to appease their kids, or just us showing like, yeah, I'm not a racist. I have hashtag BLM at the end of my posts or whatever. And this is an interesting debate, right? It's you see this regularly occurring in the media where people who participate in some kind of online, activist campaign as Slacktivists. Like a reference to a slacker who's somebody who doesn't want to work, doesn't want to do, the hard work of actually showing up and earning a salary and providing for her or his family. That's a slacker. And so a slacktivist is or like pajama activism, right? Where we just sit in our pajamas and go like, yeah, like, okay, done. I've been protesting enough for now. I want to go back to my YouTube playlist. It is a beautiful example of something that I've been mentioning for these last couple of weeks, which is this sort of how easy it is to be normative about all of this, to be saying this is good and that's bad. The only real activism if you actually go out in the streets and get pepper sprayed by the police, then you're a real activist. All this hashtag la-di-da stuff is not, well, like you said, it's not real, and it will never bring about any kind of meaningful kind of change. Or you would say the exact opposite. It's like, no, this is evidence that the world is engaged and that this is participatory culture and that we're all, that the youth of today is really engaged more than any generation before. You hear these kind of claims all the time. And you know what? I'm not going to say both of them are wrong. It's just, when I say it this way, we should all, as media scholars, immediately think, but what's really going on? And what's really going on is that when media become involved in activism, it's never the other way around. Like, people don't become activists because they saw something in the media, right? People become activists because something is happening in their lives or to their friends' lives or the people they care about. And yes, other people then perhaps later get involved one way or another, but at the heart of it, activism doesn't follow media. So let's make that thing very clear. But through our media environment, a typical environment that we're in, this online environment, very specific local instances of activism, a 16-year-old girl who decides to sit outside of the House of Parliament in her country to protest the fact that her government isn't doing enough to fight climate change, becomes a global phenomenon. Right? I'm talking about Greta Thunberg, of course, and her strike for klimatet. That is her climate strike, which she started a couple of years ago, and that became this global phenomenon. It became global because of all these people being slackers or pajama activists or what's not, spreading her message. And that message then resonated with already existing activists and environmental movements all over the world who latched onto it. So you could argue that without this slacktivism, it wouldn't have generated the kind of energy that it has now, even up to today. So this is not to say that, that makes it good or bad. It just means that it's sort of an inevitable byproduct of the kind of networked culture that we're in, that happens. And yes, some people will definitely participate in these kind of things as a way of and we call this virtue signaling, right? Virtue signaling is where you show off that you did something nice. I just donated my hard-earned money to this cause. You should join me. And it's like, yeah, that's very nice. Yes, we love you, whatever. There is this great Twitter account that is called "How Do I Make This About Myself?" and it documents these kind of things. It's really beautiful. And yes, so there's some degree of virtue signaling going on. And I think that's really great what you said about social desirability. Well, this will make me look better. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. But isn't anything? Everything is. It's like we're always communicating both authentically how we feel, and we're communicating to show off a certain thing, a certain identity, who we are, where we belong to, who do we want us to like, and stuff like that. And then we, so that is always present of all forms of our communication. What is interesting is that in contemporary activist movements, the kind of sort of slacktivism becomes sort of an intrinsic ingredient of a very real local struggle, right? It blurs the boundaries between what happens locally. Again, a little girl sitting outside a parliament with a little cardboard sign, and a global struggle of people all over the world genuinely anxious about what's happening to our environment. And, 20, 30 years from now, when, we'll have a climate that is 1.5 or 2 degrees warmer than it is now. So it's both. And that's part of its complexity. And like I said earlier, as some people now suggest, it's perhaps part of its strength. And that's why we have more activism today than at any other point in history. And then skeptics, that's my last comment, would then argue, yeah, we might have more people engaged in activism, but we have less change happening. I mean, we used to have rebellions and revolutions, and now we have activism. We used to have people overthrowing governments, like the Indian Revolution, the American Revolution, the British Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And now we have people, hashtag Black Lives Matter. American police are still killing African Americans. So, I mean, this sounds horribly cynical, what I'm saying right now, but what the point I'm making is it's fairly complicated, this phenomenon, but it is, I think, an important element of media activism, that we look at the activism in and of itself, how it exists beyond and outside of media, and then the role that particular media play in how that kind of activism evolves. So that today, media activism evolves in a networked context. So local struggles get taken up in global debates and vice versa. And that's something rather unique. And slacktivists, for lack of a better term, play a role in this, and not altogether unuseful role. So to conclude, I'm going to go back to Maria, who was very kind enough to post her question in the chat. I really appreciate that. She asks, Maria, if you allow me to speak for you, this notion of internalized surveillance. And specifically, she talks about the male gaze, because we, especially women, grow up with standards and expectations that Eurocentric male-dominated media impose on us. Very important point. An example is a quote by Margaret Atwood, great author, about male fantasies. You are a woman with a man inside watching a woman. You are your own voyeur. And how we can only pretend that we are unconscious of an ever-present watcher peeping in our minds and intimate lives. How would you explain this internalized surveillance? Yeah, that is a very powerful question and a very powerful observation too, right? I mean, it's one thing to document the representation, for example, of women in, let's say, video games. Right, this is a recurring theme in game studies, a part of media studies, where we look at the over-sexualization of female characters. With they always wear. There's funny sketches on this on YouTube as well. Like, if male and female avatars in games get the choice of gear, and then you put it on a male character, and he's all like armor everywhere, and you put it on a female character, and all she wears is a bikini. Protect you against, slasher weapons. Yeah, right. So it's one thing to document that, right, and saying, well, that needs to change. And in the game community, this is a very active discussion. So that's one way of looking at it. But then what about people internalizing these representations? Right? I mean, it's like nobody's telling them to act this way, but we act this way because we feel that gaze, and some among us much more stringently than others. And And this is incredibly difficult to disentangle. And as media scholars, we cannot do much else than, I think, to keep documenting representation and theorizing what representation does, to be part of discussions with industry, to remedy this, to raise the critical awareness, and I'm a media industry scholar, and I can tell you this is an absolute running and ongoing discussion within the industry. I'm not saying that means everything is going to be fine and changed, no, but there is something happening there, and I appreciate media scholars being part of that conversation. I think we should do much more work in that area. And then finally, it is also to point out something that I think was also present in the literature of today, which especially Annabelle's piece about how older people use media, is that it's one thing to use media to find out what is expected of you and internalize that. But we also live in a media environment where you can either circumvent that, critique that, or find people to support you in being different, or challenge these kind of normative assumptions or these gazes that we're all part of in different ways. I mean, just as the male gaze produces a kind of femininity that is incredibly reductive of the complexity of what a human being is who happens to be a woman, the same happens, or same, not the same, but something similar happens to men, and we call it toxic masculinity, right? Where the identity of males is reduced to 1 or 2 or 3 cliches or stereotypes that you often cannot help but act out in order to be part of your community. And media sometimes really help us both to see these kind of oppressive representations, as well as they can provide either alternative narratives or communities of support to challenge this. And so I think we have a responsibility there to acknowledge and to witness that as well, and to document those kind of communities. So I'll finish with an anecdote today, which is one of the favorite graduate thesis projects that I ever supervised, was of a student who documented her experiences of being part of an online community called Otherkin. And Otherkin is a variety of communities online of people who know that they are not of this earth, right? They are from somewhere else. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes what they really are is a kind of animal or a mythical figure, or I guess something that you and I would call an alien or something like that. But they are otherkin. And obviously, if you say that aloud in a classroom or in a pub or at a business meeting, you'll be, laughed at. You'll be chased out of the building with tar and feathers, right? Nobody would take you seriously. Nobody. Some of you might even be grinning while I'm telling you this. But for quite a few people, this is a very real feeling and a very real part of who they are. And it turns out online, they find really supportive communities and they can be who they really are. And it was a really eye-opening study to me. And it reminded me of the power of media studies. So that was just a little anecdote that I wanted to end up with today. We're going to meet each other again Thursday morning, when we're going to be talking much more about this and about what it means to be living in the real world and whether there still is such a thing and those kind of things. So I'm really looking forward to all of that. Thanks again. Thank you for showing your cat, Doortje. I really appreciate that. There should be more animals. As some of you may know, I live partly in Amsterdam and partly in the UK. My dogs are in the UK. So next Monday, I'll be calling in from England and I'll show you my dogs because we need more animals on camera. Okay. Thanks again, and I'll see you Thursday morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.